NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
All right, I have 4 goals today. One is to identify the persuasion challenges we have, whether they be in sexual assault cases or any other kind of case. 2, what are the benefits of a narrative format, otherwise known as storytelling? I used to just call it storytelling for reasons I'll get into. I've started calling it story form or narrative. 3, some advanced storytelling techniques that you can use to really enhance the way we present a story to a trier of fact, mostly jury work, but this also can work with judges. And then 4, if we have time for Wolfen and Gilligan, then we'll share Wolfen and Gilligan with you as well. I don't know, has anybody ever heard Wolfen before? Nope? Brand new audience. Well, I hope we can get to it. All right, so first, what does the science tell us about our jurors? Number 1, they have bad memories. They remember about 60% after one day. Think about that, 60% after one day. Now, this research is about 10 years old. My understanding is I haven't followed up a lot over the last 10 years, but it hasn't gotten any better. What we know is that adult attention spans are getting less. That's just a given. That's just a given. And finally, we know that people make decisions based on emotion, and then they rationalize. I mean, think about what commercials are about. Commercials are never about logic. They're always about the heart zone. They're always about how we feel about things, and we make those decisions. So, what is the average attention span of an adult human? If you've read my materials, you know this answer. There have been other people talking about it. Don't shout it out if you read it or you know it. If you don't, just take a second, think to yourself, what is it? Is it like 3 minutes? Back in the Lincoln-Douglas debate days, they used to listen to debates for 8 hours long, right? It's not 8 hours, I guarantee you that. 2 minutes, 1 minute? It's 8 seconds. The average adult attention span is 8 seconds. Now, to be fair, there was a study put out by a company, and I've got the information and the citation in the materials, that would benefit from talking about this. Nonetheless, we know that it's very, very short. And in that same study, they talk about the fact that a goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds, right? So in general, we have an attention span of less than a goldfish, which means about 90% of you forgot why I even brought this up. We also know that we learn 3 ways. We learn by seeing something, we learn by hearing something like a lecture, and we learn by doing something, kinesthetic. Some people learn better by just doing it, right? Other people learn by seeing, other people learn by hearing somebody talk about it. It used to be, if we go back to the 1800s, as far as we could tell, that those were all about even. It'd be like 30% of one, 30% of other among the population. That has changed radically over the years, as you might imagine, to much more visual. I mean, it's all the handheld devices that we have. It's the MTV taking camera shots, average of 3 seconds in between camera shot now. Where, if you go back and you watch the old sitcoms, there would be a minute that would go by with just one camera shot. So our attention spans are getting less, and we become more and more visual. And then finally, we learn from Aristotle, thousands of years ago at this point, that there are 3 ways that we persuade people. Ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos being the character of the speaker, right? Do we believe them? That's why marketing people will use, well-known people, celebrities, to sell stuff. The fact that Shaq, gets insurance from the general, I mean, does that mean the general's any good? I don't know. But Shaq gets it, so it must be okay, right? That's the theory there. It's based on the character of the speaker. And then logos, of course, is logic, which is where we spend most of our time in law school, is thinking about logic when we're digesting cases and that sort of thing. But as we know, and again, it's the marketing folks who do this stuff. That's not what sells. That's not what persuades. What persuades is, of course, pathos, emotion, imagination. We make those decisions. When you see a car commercial, it used to be, if you go back 10 years, 15 years, car commercials were designed towards men, and there would be a beautiful woman next to the car, as if somehow the beautiful woman was going to come with the car, right? Made no sense, but that's what the emotion was. Now, thankfully, that's changed. But now what you see is a car on a winding highway in the middle of a beautiful area. And because if you buy that car, there's little places you're going to drive. If you live in a city, it's going to be just like driving on that road from now on, right? Again, it's all emotion. And at the end, they talk about the miles per gallon and all that sort of stuff so that you can then use that to rationalize the decision you're making in your heart. This is really the emphasis of marketing, right? The psychology of advertising is ethos, pathos, and logos. How do we use those? Marketing spends more money than anybody else in the world, with one exception that I'm going to get to in a little bit, on trying to figure this stuff out. They spend a lot more time researching this stuff than we do, I'll tell you that. The more we can learn from what sells, the more we can learn how to persuade, even if it's only 12 people at a time. So, how is storytelling going to help us with this? Well, first of all, I wanted to define what is storytelling, because it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. This is a definition I came up with. I think it's somewhat accurate. Could quibble with some words, I suppose. The art of using your words, body, and emotion to carefully and powerfully describe a past or future event in a way that engages the listener and leads them to reflect on the learning embedded in the story. I don't know. Seems to me that's what we're trying to do in a courtroom. When our last speaker was talking about opening statements and how important they are, I was thinking, yeah, that's what this is about. We're trying to do exactly what's right here, I think. Right? We're trying to use these parts of our aspect, of our ability to persuade with our body, to teach about what's embedded within the story. So, with ethos, with regard to storytelling, listeners like a good storyteller. There's research on this, but think in your own way. You've all heard a good storyteller. It's mesmerizing. Time goes by. You get caught up in the moment. You visualize it. You're there. You can smell. You can touch. You can feel. We access a different part of our brain when we are in story than when we're in logic. And it's the part of our brain that allows us to imagine, to go someplace, to be there with the story. You can, I think, see how important that could be in trying to describe the story of innocence within the case. It allows us to introduce the material in a way that is interesting. Who here has ever seen, dare I say, given an opening that's just a series of facts that are sort of inconsistent in no logical fashion and confusing as hell? Who's ever seen that before? Right? Yeah, I've done it. We've all done it. We've certainly seen it. If we put it in the form of a story, particularly in the opening, we're putting it in a way that makes sense to people. It's how we compute. It's how we make sense of the world. I mean, every religion has always used story to pass down wisdom and information. Politicians use story to make their point, and now it's also driven by emotion, really driven by emotion. And allows for the active demonstration of a true belief. I think this is important. When we are trying a case, and I'm not going to say you have a story of innocence in every case. There are some where you don't, but there's still aspects of story we can use. But if what we're doing is getting up is simply trying to knock down a house of cards, which was the approach from what I can tell from my research back in the days of Clarence Darrow and even through Edward Bennett Williams, we're knocking down the house of cards. If it doesn't stand up, you have to find the person not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. People aren't buying that anymore. They just aren't. I mean, they really want to know who did what to who and why did they do it and what are the motivations, right? So if we're getting up there and all we're doing is saying they haven't proven the case, it's sort of what I recall as the Bart Simpson defense. If any of you are a buddy of Bart Simpson as I am, I didn't do it. You didn't see me do it. You can't prove I did it, right? That's the Bart Simpson defense. And I think we want to avoid that if we can. Pathos allows us to connect to the humanity of the story with the jury. We become a conduit between our client, ourselves, and then our jury. It allows for the jury to engage in their imaginative capacity to understand what has occurred, and allows us to engage our warrior heart and poet's sword at the same time. And finally, logos allows us to introduce the material in a way that is organized. Again, there's nothing worse than a disorganized opening. Creates a context by which to judge the evidence as it is introduced, and a visual component attached to an emotional connection in a narrative format allows for a logical discussion at the end of the case. Boy, there's a lot in that statement. We're going to come back to that in a second, but first, who's ever heard of DARPA? Few people. Don't right now, because I'm about to show you a video. When you get a chance, when I'm boring you to death, look up DARPA, because it's scary shit, all right? When I talked about somebody spending more money on research in this stuff than marketing, these are the folks. But this video is great, and it's good for what we're talking about today.
I want to tell you a story about a little boy named Ben. Ben is 2.5 years old, and Ben has brain cancer. And Ben's really happy. He's happy because he's been through 2 rounds of chemo and radiation, and he feels good for once. He doesn't feel yucky, and his father's enjoying seeing Ben's happiness. But as the father tells the story of Ben and his cancer, the father's voice begins to break. And he says, it's very difficult to play with Ben because Ben thinks everything is wonderful, but I know something that Ben doesn't, that Ben's dying. And he talks about how difficult it is to play with Ben, knowing that in 3 or 6 months, Ben will be dead. And yet Ben is so happy, he's so beautiful. And so the father tries as hard as he can to enjoy Ben, to be joyful around Ben. But then he says in the middle of this short story that it's an amazing thing to know how little time one has left. And as he says that statement, he has merged himself with his son. It's as if the father himself is dying. So in my laboratory, we've studied this story extensively. And what we found is that 2 primary emotions were elicited. One is distress, and the other is empathy. At the same time, when we asked people what they felt after the story was over, we really couldn't get very clear answers. So we began doing other studies on this story. So we took blood before and after, and we found that the brain produced 2 interesting chemicals. One is called cortisol, which focuses our attention on something important. So cortisol correlated with our sense of distress. So the more distress you felt, the more cortisol you released, and the more you paid attention to that stimulus. The second chemical release is called oxytocin, which is associated with care and connection and empathy. And oxytocin was correlated with people's sense of empathy. And the more oxytocin they released, the more empathic they felt towards Ben and his father. Now, we did something different after this experiment. We gave individuals a chance to share money with a stranger in the lab. And indeed, those who produced both cortisol and oxytocin were more likely to donate money generously to a stranger they couldn't see in the lab. In another experiment, we gave individuals a chance to donate money to a charity that works with children who are ill. And indeed, those who released oxytocin and cortisol donated money to this charity. And in fact, the amount of oxytocin released predicted in both cases how much money people would share with a stranger or with charity. What we're seeing is that this narrative is changing behavior by changing our brain chemistry. So we decided to go a little further and ask, could we actually predict before they watched the video who would donate money to charity? So with funding from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, we reran the study in which we not only took blood, but now we measured heart rate and skin conductance and respiration. And using these additional measures, we were able to identify this distress response and this empathic response, and we could predict with 80% accuracy who would donate money to charity. These individuals get paid about $20 to be in an experiment, and the people who donated money on average donated half their earnings. So we began to investigate this story further. We used functional brain imaging to identify the regions in the brain that were most active while watching that video compared to a control video in which Ben and his father were at the zoo. And what we found was that the most active areas for the emotional story were areas in the brain associated with theory of mind or understanding of what others are doing, and areas that are rich in oxytocin receptors that make us feel empathy. And guess what happens when you watch 100 seconds of a father and son at the zoo? Nothing happens and people just blank out. There's no reason for them to attend to this information because nothing's happening. There's nothing exciting. It's important to understand that stories have to have this particular structure. 150 years ago, a German theorist named Freytag called this the dramatic arc. So there are particular story aspects that go into making an effective story: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and then this denouement. The story of Ben and his father talking about knowing his son is dying has those aspects. It captures their attention. There's a coming climax. How can Ben's father actually engage with his son in this wonderful, relaxed, playful way, yet knowing that his son will die soon? It seems like there may be a universal kind of story structure. So stories are powerful because they transport us into other people's worlds, but in doing that, they change the way our brains work and potentially change our brain chemistry. And that's what it means to be a social creature, is to connect to others, to care about others, even complete strangers. And it's so interesting that dramatic stories cause us to do this. In these experiments, they do it in a very functional way. People are donating money because they want to help Ben and his father. And yet when we watch other stories or see movies, listen to music, the same thing can happen. We feel uplifted, we feel motivated, or we feel connected to others around us.
So about 25 years ago, I started talking about story in the courtroom because it just made sense to me with my background in writing, about how we could craft and then direct the emotions within the court and have people feel something. About 5 years, it's about 7 years ago, I was asked to speak at a conference where everything was evidence-based practice. So everything you were going to talk about had to have research behind it. So I actually then had to dig down and find stuff like this that supports what I just knew to be true as somebody who had worked in the arts about how story works. And of course, there is this research. And there's more and more of it every day. You know, we want to know why people do things. That's what this is about. We want to feel that emotion, then we want to give. And then also, towards the beginning of that video, talks about tension being part of it. That tension is, of course, us helping the jury to understand that they don't want to convict an innocent person. When you combine those three things, the narrative, the emotion, and the risk of convicting the innocents, right? Because we are a risk-averse animal for the most part. That's how this all comes together and starts to work. So story form enhances organization, captures the imagination, develops emotional connection, is interesting, provides a logical format to discuss, and reaches all three adult learning styles. Because for the oral person, when you're listening to the story, that's how you learn. For the visual person, if you're telling a story that's in a story form, you're going to use word pictures. Somebody who's visual is going to see it occur, and that's how they're going to remember it. And for the kinesthetic learners, this is the easiest stuff ever. All you have to do with a kinesthetic learner, they're less and less, by the way, but for those on your jury, as you're telling a story, all you have to do is do something like this. If you want to know why that happened, come with me. Come on. Let's go across town to the other side of town. Now, of course, they're not going to get out of their chairs and do that, but they're imagining that they are, right? So now they're active within the story. Things like that can get people, even the kinesthetic learners, involved in the aspect of storytelling. What happens when we don't tell a story? We simply get up in the opening and say, they can't prove the case. Yeah, my cousin Vinny opening. Everything that guy had said is bullshit, right? And we sit down. Now, I'll tell you, I've wanted to do that a few times where I didn't think I had much to work with. But I'm going to show you another video based on some more research. Last video, I promise. All right, this has no sound. Just watch it, and then we're going to talk about what happens. Who here saw something other than just random shapes moving around? Like characters of some sort, or maybe even a story. What did you see?
The triangle was a bully.
The triangle was a bully.
And was going after the other triangle.
And was going after the other triangle. Okay. Go ahead.
Are you sure you want me to continue?
I am. I'm absolutely sure.
And the other triangle was the hero for the circle.
And then there was another one who was a hero. Good. Who else saw something similar or different? Yeah, what did you see? Oh. You saw a domestic DV case, right? Right? What were you going to say over here? Same thing. How many people saw something like DV? Yeah. So I did note, this was different from the last time I was in Las Vegas. They now deliver THC. So I'm not saying this has anything to do with your perception. Just throwing it out there as a possibility, right? How many people here saw something that was more than just shapes? The great majority of people will see a narrative. Why is that, do you think? The way our brains are built. That's exactly right. We need to make sense out of what seems like random things. How many people here have tried a case, and then afterwards you were able to talk to the jury, or an investigator talked to the jury, or somebody talked to the jury, and they decided a case based on facts that weren't even in the case? That's this. That's this. This is what this is about. That's what this study's about. We try to figure this shit out if we don't know. We make it up. We fill in the blanks. If we're not telling a story, we risk them creating their own story, right? We risk them creating their own story. And if we're not countering the story that's on the other side, we're way behind. We're way behind. They're going to fill in the blanks from the other side. So we remember when there's a visual component. Remember I said this earlier. A visual component talked about Ben and his dad, the shapes. An emotional context. Now the shapes doesn't have emotion, but the DARPA research shows what happens with emotion. And it's in a narrative format. These all come together and it makes sense. It's how we figure out the world. It's how we understand meaning in the world. It's how we figure out motivation. The Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys opened in northern Florida in 1900. For more than a century, it was one of the country's largest and most notorious homes for abandoned children and those deemed wayward. Boys as young as 6 were chained to walls. There were reports of rape, forced labor, solitary confinement. More than 100 children died at the school between 1913 and 1960. How many people are familiar with that story at all? Right? I was somewhat familiar with it in a sort of, I had heard about it way. This was really uncovered because some people were doing some research around that area and found graves. I mean, we're hearing more and more about that stuff with indigenous Americans, sadly too, right? But this was in Florida. And then I read this book. Anybody read this book? Strongly, strongly recommend it. It's a novelization of that school. But it makes it in such a way that you can't forget it. It makes it real. It makes it come home. It's not just facts, right? It's not just facts on a piece of paper. It has the narrative. It has the arc. It has the emotion. It makes us care. That's a book. The same thing happens with movies. If I were to ask you if you had seen a really good movie recently, that's something that was meaningful. If I were to ask you right now to just sort of tell me the plot, tell me the things that were meaningful, you'd be able to do it. And I dare say most of you didn't show up at the movie theater or in Netflix taking notes. You would just remember it because of the way story works. You get caught up in this story so you recall it. Where if you read about something in history, unless it's moving to you or you have a historical sort of memory mind, you're not going to remember it in that same way. An example that I would give is a movie I saw recently. I'm a little bit behind on my movies. Judas and the Black Messiah. I grew up in Chicago. Everybody knew that Fred Hampton was executed by the FBI and the Chicago police. It was just known. And then I saw this movie and I wept. I just wept. Because all of a sudden the story was more meaningful. It was more real. It was just more real to me. Right? I connected with it in a way I never had before it had just been facts about the Chicago police. That's how story works for us and works for jurors. So, story form narrative, where do we start? Now, the reason I use story form narrative instead of storytelling is this. When we say storytelling, it sort of sounds like fiction, doesn't it? I mean, most people who say, tell me a story, it sounds like fiction. What I'm talking about, though, is the form of narrative, of using narrative, or using the story form to organize and persuade, as opposed to creating a story out of whole cloth. We want to start with the client, discovering the narrative. I'm a big proponent. That's a talk for another day, or not, as the case may be. But if you're interested in it, I've written an article about direct. Just send me an email. I'm sure my email is in the materials. That talks about why I think it's really important to put a client on stand if you can. I know there's a lot of people here that disagree with me about that, but I feel passionately about that. And that's always where I'm going to start, then, is with the client to figure out the story of the case. Visiting the scenes, I can't tell you how important it is to actually go to the scene in the story. Every scene has its own memory that we want to access, so that when we're talking about it, we're visualizing it. Imaginative homework and visualized practice. It also, if anybody wants this PowerPoint, I will share anything I've ever written or put together. Send me an email, I'll send you the PowerPoint. I see some people trying to take some pictures. I'm happy to send it to you. The opening story narrative creates a prism. What I mean by that is, if we get up and we give the more compelling story an opening, the jury is likely to see evidence through that prism as it comes in. They'll be looking at it and thinking, does this fit with what Belzer told me in the opening? Because I agree with our last speaker, openings are evidence to the jury. I mean, it really is, right? That's just how they see it. So I'm sure you know this, but don't ever get up and say what I'm about to say is not evidence, because, man, I love my speaking much more than anybody else speaking in the courtroom at that point. There's no question. I'd rather be testifying than anyone else. So that's the prism we're going to create by telling a compelling story. My openings are really, literally, nothing more than a story. I get up, I start with the story. Hopefully I've organized it. It's got an arc, it's got drama. And at the end, I sit down without asking for a not guilty, without explaining what the defense is. If I haven't spent enough time on that opening, that it's obvious what the defense is, and it's obvious my person's not guilty, then I haven't done enough work yet. I haven't figured it out yet. Because stories, when we see movies, they don't have to tell us whether the person is a good person or a bad person or not guilty or guilty. It's obvious. Steven Spielberg, who's a pretty good storyteller, I would say, had this to say, though, and this has to do with openings. Has anybody here, and I'm going to put my hand up, I'll be the first one to admit it, sort of written their opening in the car on the way to court on the morning you're going to give it? Like in your head. Fuck yeah, right? I've done it. Hopefully I haven't done it in a long time, but yeah, I've done it. My God. We don't want to do that. We don't want to do that for this reason. People have forgotten how to tell a story. Stories don't have a middle or an end anymore. They usually have a beginning that never stops beginning. Anybody know a person who tells a story like that? It's like, oh, for the love of God, please bring it to an end. Or get me a butter knife because my wrists need some attention. It's like, man, I'm not going to, I have a relative who's like this, my mother. I'm not going to tell you who it is, though. So we want to spend time on it. Now, what the hell does racing pigeons, advanced techniques, have to do, breeding and pairing, with our work at hand? If there's anybody here who has an answer to this, I will be so impressed. Nothing. It has nothing to do with it, but I was looking for an image having to do with advanced techniques, and I came across this book, and I thought, this is so wild. It's like, I want to get this book and start breeding and pairing pigeons now that I had some free time. Right? It's just like, I just had to use it. But this is about advanced techniques. I told you we're going to try to get to that. I don't wear a watch, so I'm just going to check my time. All right, advanced techniques. The courtroom is, this is from a theater person in the 50s, Peter Brooks, an empty space. Courtroom is an empty space. What Peter Brooks was talking about is that theater had become too much about the trappings, the sets, the costumes, not anymore about interaction, conflict, the story, right? But for our purposes, and this is, how many people here are public defenders? Keep your hand up. Keep your hand up if you're a public defender, and you have a huge budget for demonstrative evidence. Keep your hand up. What? This is the cheapest demonstrative evidence you're ever going to hear of. We're going to use this empty space, and you can do this whether you can move around the courtroom or not. It's much easier if you can move, but you can do it even if you can't. If I don't tell you how, remind me. I can make this space in the Weller courtroom anything I want. It could be any scene that I want in the context of my case, right? It can be a car on a drunk driving case. where the officer's outside the car and you're going to create the car because you're trying to create a relationship or power imbalance, right? Or fear, whatever the case may be. It can be a bedroom in a sexual assault case, in the right sexual assault case, right? It can be the car ride with the mom and the little girl on the way to go see the social worker, right? Which was how I used it in a child sexual assault case. Created that car ride because that car ride was crucial to what was said after that and why it was so inconsistent with anything that had come out before that. It could be a bedroom where somebody allegedly climbed in through a window to have non-consensual sex with somebody, and you're going to create how unreasonable that would be given the makeup of the bedroom. You can create this space, and once you do, as long as you're consistent with it, the jury will see it. They'll see it. How many people have ever seen live improv? You should see more. You should see some live improv because it's amazing what they do with an empty space, right? In live improv, unlike SNL, usually it's just a blank stage, maybe a chair, maybe a hat rack. I mean, there's just not a lot, but they're creating space. And watch, what happens is every single actor that's up there has a contract with each other that if I create a space, we're in a bus. Then everybody else who's in that scene is in a bus. Nobody's going to violate that rule. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create a space that's consistent with not guilty or innocence in our case. We're going to be consistent with it. We're going to respect it. We're going to refer to it throughout the trial, and we're going to revisit it during the closing argument. Let me give you a concrete example. The Old Style Inn. Anybody ever been to the Old Style Inn in La Crosse, Wisconsin? It's a great place. You have? No shit. What? Well, La Crosse is way in western Wisconsin. Okay, there could be another one. I mean, Old Style was a big beer in Chicago and Wisconsin for a while. This one's in La Crosse, Wisconsin. And I had a case at the Old Style Inn. Here's a couple of pictures from the case. The one on the top there is the front of the building. I don't know if you can tell, but there's two doors. There's a door that's closest to you, blue, and a little bit further down, there's a little bit blue there. That's the second door, right? This is in the inside. Straight back is where the bar is. Got a patron here, obviously. And then, you know, they have some gambling machines, that sort of thing there, for fun only. For fun only. So my case is, my guy's the bartender. He's got a sawed-off bat behind the bar filled with lead. A guy comes in screaming about the Afghanistan war, acting sort of unruly, a little bit scary. My guy whacks him on the head, busts his head open, causes permanent brain damage. The allegation was reckless endangerment, first-degree reckless endangerment, that there wasn't defense of others, defense of self, that sort of thing. Our defense it was defense of others more than self. What I did in the opening is I set up the courtroom, the wall of the courtroom, as if the jury is right where those chairs are, sitting up against the bench. You see what I'm talking about? Right? And my guy's then right behind them. So if you're the jury, I'm going to talk about the fact that Mr. Johnson was standing here, and the patrons at the bar were about where you all are. Now, behind you on that side would be one door, and over on that side is the other door, and we got the gambling machines over here, right? And so then I set this whole thing up, and every time I talk about the guy coming in and what he's saying, I'm doing it right here, and I'm like, can you see him coming in? This is the opening, right? This is all the opening. Can you see him coming in? Kinesthetic people, right? Can you see him coming in? He's yelling. The bartender's scared for himself, but not as much. He's scared for these other people because the people are turning around to look. They're turning around, they're looking. Now, when you're from the front row, you're having this urge to run to look because that's just the nature, right? They're turning around and looking. And we set up this whole thing. Do the cross-examination of the guy who got his head whacked open. Do the same thing. I want you to imagine that we're in the bar right now. You're on the witness stand. I want you to imagine we're in the bar and that the bar is right here and that the doors are there and there. Are you with me? And we do the whole cross where he's now in my space, right? Same thing on the direct with my client. Mr. Johnson, you heard me talk about this earlier. I set up the bar there with the doors in the back. Is that accurate? All right, well, tell us some more. Give us some more description about it. Right, and he sets up the whole thing, and then I'm standing down here as if I'm him for that entire direct while he's up there telling me what's happening, and I'm watching it happen as he's explaining what I'm seeing, right? Does that make sense? And you get up in the closing, and you remember when he came in? You remember how scared people were? They're all in that same place. That's the story. That's the power of the story. The judge, who I know fairly well, told me after the case that the trial was over in the opening because the story was so real and so compelling, he didn't see how anybody was ever going to erase it. And what's interesting is the prosecutor in that case walks into my bar, right? I now have home court advantage because he's using the bar I set up. If you ever have a prosecutor who does this shit to you, wipe it away. Just get up and say, no, that's not where the bar was. It was set up like this. The bar was over here, right? Don't buy into their story. We create our own. So that's an example of how that works. We can use demonstrating time and space in our blank space, right? The way I showed you earlier. Talking about, this was a case I had with armed robbery. The three guys were in the car on the south side. Meanwhile, while they were there, client, I wouldn't call him that in court, I don't remember what his name was anymore, was way over 6 blocks away. Again, I've created this space between, and I can do the same thing with time. To understand why that happened, come back in time with me. That's the example I gave you earlier. Symbolic interactionism. Where does he come up with this shit? Prosecutor CI. We can make symbolic relationships. Who here, preferably in the first few rows, I'm sorry, I'm going to rat somebody out right now. Who here has ever been a prosecutor? Way back there. You're too far back. Nobody in the front rows? No? Here? Are you okay? Yeah? All right. How long you been in recovery? All right. You're my prosecutor, right? Witness stand up here. We got the confidential informant on the stand. Who do I want to tie the confidential informant to? There's only one other person in the courtroom right now, so it's got to be the prosecutor, right? Come on, people, work with me. So I want to tie it to the prosecutor. I'm going to start talking to the confidential informant when I get to anything having to do with an agreement, and I'm going to be standing in the proximity of the prosecutor. Everything I do is going to tie this person, right? And I want to mostly make them not likable, although there might be a different approach. But I want to tie this person and everything they're saying to this person. It's even better if you have a courtroom where you can really walk around. We're going to switch. You're now prosecutor. Doing the cross-examination, you don't want to. Just take a shower afterwards. You'll be all right. So I'm doing the cross here. And then, this is great shit. I mean, I'm telling you, this is so much fun. You should have to pay to do it. You walk behind the prosecutor, right? And you're standing there saying, and who's the prosecutor, right? And then the prosecutor, they're hiding their notes now. Because their notes are pretty damn fucking precious. They don't want you to see their notes. You're going to get their whole case as if we don't know already, right? So you're behind them. The prosecutor's making furtive gestures in the courtroom, right? Is that not the definition of a furtive gesture? They're trying to hide shit, right? And then, some of you have seen this before. It bears repeating. The most wonderful moment in court. Mr. Confidential Informant, that person you made the agreement with. Let me ask you this. Do you see him? Is that person in court? Yeah. Can you point to him and tell us something he's wearing? Your Honor, may the record reflect he's pointed out the prosecutor in that cheap suit from Kmart. By the way, I get my suits from Kmart too. I was never an expensive suit person. So it's just about creating those relationships, right? Because that sticks. That's how story works. Okay. You can do the same thing if you've got a victim that's unlikable. Maybe there's a battered women's syndrome case I worked on where we tied the prosecutor to a dead guy who was a total asshole. And it worked. I mean, frankly, it worked. What did we think it through? Is that going to work? It did there.
The CLE verification code for this program is 5T6124. 5T6124.
Artifact of memory recall. This is something I came up with in a fever dream one day. And what it is you take something, we all have something from our childhood, it could be as adults, that if we look at it It brings us to a place in time, right? It creates emotion. We can use that with a witness or two with our client, right? Something that centers them. This is a case I had, Eric Kola. He was accused of killing his mother and father, who were just wonderful people, for a $6 million inheritance. And we had to put him on the stand. It was the longest direct I've ever done. It was a full-day direct, longest direct I've ever done on a criminal case. Full-day direct. And we needed to start off with primacy, something really powerful. The only way I thought we could win the case is that he and his father were best friends. And if the jury believed that to be true, there was a good chance they could not find that he could kill his own dad, right? So to start off, what we did is I brought him up an artifact. This is before any question has been asked, right? We walk in, he sits down, I take a moment, I look at him, I nod, I breathe to remind him to breathe, and then I walk up and I show him this picture. It's a picture of he and his dad golfing, right? And I say, Eric, I just want you to take a minute and just look at that picture and remember what it was like. And he did, and the jury saw him go from somebody who seemed scared and nervous, and they're thinking maybe he killed his dad, to see him as a son who loved his father, all right? It was magical. I mean, it changed the mood of the court. It really was helpful. The mood got changed the next day, though, when the Attorney General's office started doing cross-examination. It did not go well. Sometimes that happens. This is my very good friend Colette Tevet. This is another technique you can use. For those of you, I tend to think of everything in visual terms. Colette does not. One time, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, she used to be a public defender in Boston. She now is practicing in Denver. She was telling me about a case she had. It was a shooting case with some gang members, and her client's name was Tigger. And she was trying to explain to me what happened, but she couldn't speak of it in visual terms, so she started drawing it out on, this will tell you where we were, on a bar nap, right? So she started drawing all these pictures. And I said, oh my God, Colette, what you're doing is storyboarding. Some of you know what that is. Storyboarding is what directors do when they're going to do a film. They storyboard out what's going to happen so that they're not wasting union time by trying to figure out what they're doing, right? It's expensive to film. So they draw out where the camera angles are, what they're going to do. Some people have found this very helpful to do with the trial, whether it be the actual story or the parts of a cross-examination or things of that nature. So I just threw that out there. If you're going to do that, I would say you want to think deeper than just the pictures, though. What is the factual information? What are the word pictures to be created? What other senses are conveyed? What is the emotional reality for the client? What is the emotional reality for others? And what is the emotional reality for us, right? That's something too. And then what is the precise intent of the chapter? We cannot play an entire chapter at once. You cannot do an entire opening at once. Any story has moments, right? If you watch a film, there are scenes. They don't say scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, but you're watching, you know this is a different scene. We want to break up the stuff we're doing so we're playing individual moments instead of playing the end of the opening when I'm still at the beginning. That allows us to be present with the jury. This is first-person present sense. This was a civil case I worked on. This guy is Scott Lawson. He's a Vietnam vet who ended up with schizophrenia, was going through a small town in Wisconsin, got arrested for having burglarious tools on his person. He had a knife. That was it. That was a burglarious tool. He was homeless. He had a knife on his person. So he gets arrested. He's actively psychotic. So he's washing his hair in the sink. He's lighting his hair on fire, or washing his feet in the sink, lighting his hair on fire. So they put him in isolation. Everyone there called it the hole, which was this little room that size with no light on it except for one 20-watt bulb that was on 24/7. The only contact he had with anybody for 67 days was when a jailer would slide food through a tray. We've sued the jail for not getting him medical treatment under Section 1983 in federal court in Madison. My brother, who's a theater designer, built this mock cell to exact dimensions of the hole, and this is how Scott testified in the cell. And the questions were, Scott, you're in the cell. What are you thinking? What are you smelling? What's going on in your mind? How are you feeling? Because in some practice jury work we did on the case, I knew the jury thought it was bad, but they were never going to get how bad it was for him versus how bad it might have been for someone else to sit in that cell for 67 days. and it would be bad for any of us. He walked out of this with PTSD on top of schizophrenia because of that nonsense. Jury came back with the biggest verdict in history at the time. It's since been surpassed in Section 1983 of $5.6 million. And I'm telling you, the great reason was the testimony when he was in that cell. The jurors, it looked like they stopped breathing. He was in there for maybe 20 minutes. And then when we had him go back to the stand, the jury went, I mean, I swear to God, they all wanted a cigarette, whether they smoked or not. It was just like so intense. So first person present tense. Now, when I was working with Scott on this stuff, I had a therapist on call, right? If you're going to do this stuff, make sure you've got a professional who you can go to if you need, because this can be powerful stuff. And Scott trusted me enough that we got through it without any issues, and it was somewhat healing for him, as far as I can tell. But it can be some powerful stuff too. All right, we're going to skip through some stuff. Yeah, I think we're going to. If you want to know about Gilligan, it's sort of fun. It's not that important. There's an article I wrote, I want to say 10 years ago, that talks about archetypes, Joseph Campbell, and how archetypes can be used in cross-examination. And it looks like at Gilligan as a model. Some of you are looking at me like, who the hell is Gilligan, right? Because it's a little bit of an older show now. I would like to tie it to a more recent show, but the only shows I watch now are either the Cooking Network or HGN TV or documentaries on public television. So I haven't found any archetypes that would fit this concept. But at any rate, this is the music you would have heard. We'll skip that. But what I do is I take down each of these characters, talk to you about aspects of their personality, and I'm able to show you that they actually all represent the 7 deadly sins. If you know the show at all, you can probably see that parallel right there. They're actual episodes that I can point to, believe it or not, and they're in the article I wrote. This, I just took because I love Meow Wolf. Has anybody did any Meow Wolf setups yet? The one here is very good. I was thinking about I shouldn't do Gilligan anymore because it's so old, but then they had the 7 deadly sins up here as an exhibit at the art installation they had at Meow Wolf. So I took a picture. I thought, well, maybe that's a sign, but apparently it wasn't. All right, so this is just an example of a case I had where I did that technique. Closing argument is another ripe area for story, a different sort of story altogether. It's story by way of analogy. Analogies are incredible, right? Myths, Bible stories, if you know them well, know your audience. I'm a Unitarian. I wouldn't dare try to quote the Bible. I mean, it's just a suggestion to us Unitarians. Other people, those can work really well. There's some great stories in the Bible. You can use personal stories. The person who I first read about was this guy. Who knows who this guy is? Yes? Who is it? Yes, correct. Eugene Pincham. Perhaps one of the 2 greatest criminal defense lawyers in Chicago history. Keep in mind, Clarence Darrow was also from Chicago, so pretty tough competition there. He had a story. I invite you to look this up because it's not in the materials, called the Sugar Bowl story. You can still find it online at the Chicago Reader, where he talked about a personal story from his childhood and talked about how grains of sugar indicated that the state had not met their burden of proof. Great stuff, great stuff. But I wanted to come up with a story for this man. His name is Evan Zimmerman. He's one of the Innocence Project cases that Kathy talked about. He was convicted of a homicide, given a life sentence in Wisconsin. And then I came in and did the retrial. And the case was all circumstantial evidence. And I wanted to come up with a story for closing by way of analogy or metaphor that would show. Well, let me back up for a second. How many people here have heard a prosecutor give a statement in closing about how strong circumstantial evidence is, right? That, if you're walking into a house and there's dark clouds everywhere and it's thunder and you walk in, you come back out and the ground's all wet, you didn't see it rain, but it rained, right? How many people does that make you want to throw up in your mouth, right? I mean, it takes the Constitution and makes it as trite as it can possibly be. So it made me so angry. I knew this prosecutor was going to do that. I thought I need to come up with circumstantial evidence case. This is what I came up with. In the old days, the old days, there was a warrior. And the warrior had a best friend. It was his dog. It was his dog, Wolfen. The great dog, Wolfen. They were truly the best of friends. Anywhere the warrior would go, there would be Wolfen right by his side. They were inseparable. The love was tremendous. And as would happen from time to time, the warrior would be called off to war. This was so interesting. I didn't really understand it. But Wolfen would follow the warrior out through the courtyard, past the threshold to the crossroad, and they would say goodbye. Okay, that makes sense. The warrior could be gone for a month, 3 months, 6 months. Didn't matter. Whenever he came back, Wolfen knew. He would be out there at that crossroad waiting for his master. Somehow, Wolfen always knew when his master was coming home. And they would embrace, and there would be that great love. There came a time when the warrior took a bride. And as was the case in those days, the warrior got called off to war again before his bride had had their child. As he was off at war, he received word. His wife had borne him a child, a son, a firstborn son. The warrior headed home with a feeling of love that he had never experienced before. A feeling of love for his son. And as he came back, he saw the crossroad. And there was no Wolfen. And that was so unusual. And he made the turn to go up the path to the threshold into the courtyard, and there was Wolfen. But he was down, hunched way down to the ground. And there was something sort of dark and matted into his fur. And as the warrior approached, Wolfen got up, but didn't get all the way up, just partly up, and sort of slinked through that entry into the courtyard. And Wolfen led the warrior into the castle, through the castle to the back room that they had turned into a bassinet. They had turned into a nursery with the bassinet. And the warrior walked in, and he saw what had happened. The bassinet was destroyed, busted in the back. There was blood everywhere. And he looked at that dog, and he knew what Wolfen had done. And he took his sword, and he killed Wolfen. And he heard a noise. And he took that sword, and he went back to the bassinet, and he tipped up the edge a little bit to see what that noise was. And there was his son, alive. And next to his son was a rabid wolf that the great dog Wolfen had killed. He dropped his sword. And he never picked it up again. Picked up his friend. He picked up Wolfen. And he carried him past the threshold, out to the crossroad. And he buried him, and he built a large stone monument to his friend. And every day for the rest of his life, he came out to ask Wolfen for forgiveness. The sword of justice has the ability to protect the innocents if used with care and consideration. When used recklessly, it has the ability to kill the innocent. This man is innocent. Thank you. That's it.